I always wanted to do a PhD, right? I remember as a 12-year-old telling my friends in school, I'm going to do a PhD one day, and they said, "Wo kya hota hai?" So because I was, I love research, I love studying, and I love going deep into topics, but I didn't ever think that I would ever teach, right? So academia, you can't remove teaching from research, and that's not something I'd ever thought about. So when I was doing my PhD, my supervisor suggested that I try teaching a course at the university. I was at the UMass Boston, University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I told him, no, I'm never going to teach. I will work at a think tank. I'll do anything. I will never teach. So he said, well, just for my sake, why don't you try? And he suggested that I apply to the economics department at UMass and take up a position as an adjunct. So I did what he asked me to do. And when I started teaching, I was just amazed at how much I liked it and how much I was concerned for my students' learning and their well-being. And I went back to him and I said, I don't understand why I'm enjoying this so much, because I made up my mind I'd never do anything but research. So, I finished that course, I taught another one, and I realized that it was something I wanted to do. And so after I graduated, I only applied to universities. And that was, and really the rest is history. So my position at LUMS requires a lot of student interaction, and I love every minute and second of it. So your second question was, did I face any hurdles on a personal level? It was a challenge. I was raising 3 very young children. The youngest was 9 months, the oldest was 4. So I had these 3 kids, and I joined a PhD program, which was very intense. So that was really the toughest part, doing the PhD. I think the teaching career was challenging because we had moved to Pakistan by then, and we started homeschooling our kids. But I don't think that any period of my life has been as tough as those 5 years in which I was doing my PhD. So yeah, that was it. I think the family was very supportive, which is really, for a woman and a South Asian woman, that's a very big factor in in success in any type of career. Right. So something that feminist economists have talked about at great length is the male breadwinner bias, right? So the world over, and this is not just Pakistan, the assumption of public policy, of socio-cultural beliefs is that the male is the breadwinner, and anyone else, especially the female of the household, her earnings are optional or supplemental, right? So this is true for any job, and academia is no exception. So women have to work harder to get acceptance, to be taken seriously, and their careers to be given the same importance as the careers of the men in their households or in society as a whole, right? So this is a fundamental barrier for women. Not just, as I said, not just in academia, but everywhere. If you look at the business school, our numbers are improving, but we still are not at par, right? The number of female professors to number of male professors is still not at par, but our numbers are improving. So things are improving at LUMS and otherwise. The other problem that we have in academia, and this is again true for all industries, is that institutions have their own masculinities and femininities, right? So engineering is considered a very masculine career, as opposed to humanities, which is considered a feminine career. And so the business school veers more to the masculine side. And, so law, and the same can be said of law. And so that is a challenge, not just at LUMS, but really the world over. And women face this challenge when they try to choose even the subjects or areas of study, right? And then that keeps escalating as they finish their graduate work and apply for positions. They have to work harder to prove that they are here to stay and that they can make as much or more of an impact than their male peers and colleagues. So again, we have to look at the trajectory. It just doesn't happen when you apply for a job at a university, right? It happens really even before you're born, and what idea society has about you. If you are a male versus a female, what kind of careers do your parents and your peers and the social group that you're part of imagines for you, right? So I hear a lot of young women say that we want to take up science, but our families are telling us, no, you should take up humanities subjects, right? I love humanities. If I had to go back and do my PhD, it would probably be in an area of the humanities. But what I'm saying is that we start out with this socialization in which we tell boys that they have to choose particular careers and particular areas of study. And we tell women and girls that they need to go in a different direction. So that's one answer. That's the answer of socialization. That's that question that we need to really think hard about. The other one is that what changes can academia make to make it as easy for women to get tenure as it is for men, given these patriarchal circumstances. And this is coming out very clearly in these times, right? The pandemic, the COVID-19 has brought out inequalities so that they're visible now to everyone. They used to be visible to only those that were suffering. So women would feel this inequality, but now they're easy for everyone to see, right? So one of the things that has come out very clearly in these times is women's triple burden. So they are trying to earn a living. They are also trying to take care of their reproductive responsibilities, which essentially means the care work they're required to do at home. It is considered their primary responsibility to take care of the children and the elderly, and everything else that the human being needs for their well-being is considered a woman's responsibility. So when we think of things like tenure, for example, we have to consider that women's responsibilities are different from men's, right? Women cannot possibly put in 18 hours a day working on their research and writing because of these other responsibilities. So if we want them to have an equal chance at, for instance, tenure, then we've got to realize and put in place policies that understand and give women that equal chance. For instance, one thing that LUMS has done, which is great, is that it has allowed women who go on maternity leave to stop their tenure clock, right? So they do not suffer for that 1 year that they take off to take care of their babies, and they can, as soon as they rejoin, they can resume that tenure clock. Other universities, for instance, Oxford, I've heard, is doing something very important these days. So what they've realized, what everyone's realized, is that in these times of a serious pandemic, such as the one we have at our hands right now, women's labor has suddenly increased in the household, right? Previously, we had outsourced education and other domestic responsibilities, but right now, the household has become responsible for all of its care work. And when I say household, that really means the woman for the most part. So universities such as Oxford, what they're doing is that they're studying this increase in care burden, and they're factoring it in when it comes to the tenure clock. right? So this, and then I've heard that several peer-reviewed journals, top journals, what they're doing is they're collecting data on the amount, on the number of submissions that are coming from female researchers and scholars, and the submissions coming from men. And what they're finding is that the delta is significant. So women are able to write less, produce less research during this time than are men. So patriarchal societies usually have this idea that if a woman has to work, there are a few jobs that she's best at doing. So nursing is one of them, and teaching is another one, right? But when we think about teaching for women, it's usually considered that it would be K to 12 or primary and secondary education, right? Academia, entering university level career paths requires many years of intensive study. And that is not consistent with our, with Pakistan's and other patriarchal societies' ideas of what a woman should be doing, right? So being home, taking care of the family, helping the family grow is considered women's primary responsibility. While I'm not denying that, there are ways that women can do multiple things. They can take care of the family and be responsible for the nurturing of children, and at the same time follow an academic career, right? But for that, they need support. They need the support not just of, say, a domestic worker. They need the support of family, right? So in our patriarchal society, we have expectations from men as well, right? So we expect that a man, for instance, cannot change diapers, he cannot cook, he cannot clean, right? So this is a cultural imposition on men from which both men and women suffer, right? And so what we need to do is to look at this carefully. We have to see how are we raising our men and our women. So because unless you have an ecosystem that is supportive of women's long years of study, which is what is required if she wants to enter academia, and then subsequent career in academia, we have to take a careful look at just the ecosystem. We cannot expect the woman to be a superwoman all the time, to be able to do everything without the support of family. And when I say family, I mean both parents and husbands and brothers and sisters and even children, yeah? So this is a conversation that I have very often with my colleagues in North America. And unfortunately, what I found is that, as you said, this is pretty much a global phenomenon. So the context differs, and therefore the extent of inequality differs. But for instance, what my colleagues in North America tell me, and what I've observed myself, is that it's difficult for both women and people of color to have the same trajectory as white men, for instance, right? Because when you have a norm, the policies will always move towards the norm. So for instance, I teach my students, and when I teach public policy, I tell them there is no such thing as gender neutrality. When you hear the word that this is a gender neutral policy, then you should know that this policy is biased towards the norm. And the norm is always the male. And in countries such as North America, the norm is the white male, right? So wherever the policies are not taking into account exceptions and how to deal with exceptions, then there will be bias. And so the same bias I see in the US at least, right? I see that women who have produced, for instance, as much in terms of research and who have done no less service and teaching have a harder time getting tenure, and then have a harder time going from associate professor to professorship, right? So I've seen this struggle at universities as prestigious as Harvard, and even public universities like the place where I got my PhD, which is UMass Boston. Yeah, so you're right. This is pretty much a global phenomenon. Let's start from the global and go to the local. Globally, about a decade and a half or 2 decades ago, business schools started to realize that they cannot just focus on the principles of profit maximization, right? Because there's a huge responsibility on business schools. Business schools produce leaders, and these leaders often are not just leaders of private corporations, but also public sector organizations, right? And so we, in this particular area, and that is the business school, I would say the global north started to make this change earlier. So there are PhDs in social change at business schools, right? Entire PhD programs. I know there is one at Harvard, I know there's one at UMass, and there are such programs all over now. So this is a very important development. And then of course, diversity and inclusion is a very common, in fact, sometimes not just an elective, but a core course in business schools across the world. One advantage that LUMS business students, management students have had is the fact that we have such a vibrant humanities and social science school. So our students have been able to take courses that talk about social justice and economic inequalities across the quad in Gurmani, right? I think that it's time that we now develop a core competency in this area. So the diversity and inclusion at the workplace elective that I offer at the MBA level is one of those courses that focus not on profit maximization, but within the realm of these business realities. How is it that we equalize the workplace, that we make it easier not just to recruit, but also to promote and minority populations, right? And we've had a very interesting experience with inviting leaders from the business community all across Pakistan who've talked about initiatives in their own organizations. And so it's been very heartening to learn that this is a trend that has taken hold in Pakistani corporations, both multinationals, locals, public and private sector. And I think that much more needs to be done. One area that I feel is very important that we haven't yet been able to pay attention to, but I hope we will in the coming years, is labor relations, right? So labor is, historically, Pakistan has been a very neoliberal country in terms of labor relations. Labor has not received the kind of attention that, for instance, it has in neighboring India. And that has been, I feel, one reason why our GDP growth has not taken off. Why is it that we're not able to do as well as other countries? Because we are not emphasizing the rights and responsibilities of managing a diverse workforce. Yeah, so that's an area where I think that LUMS can certainly take a lead on. I think that it's also important to teach diversity and inclusion at the undergraduate level. One way that this is being done is through the policy and public management minor that a group of faculty currently offers. So, we have topics in social policy, and we have public administration, intro to public policy. And those courses, I've noticed if you look at the course outlines, social and economic justice is a very important part of that. Another course that's being offered by Dr. Asfar is organizing and organizations. So those courses, I think, are giving our students a different worldview from what normal courses in finance, accounting, management science tend to do. And so I think that we are moving in the right direction, but I do agree with you. We need to be more focused about this, especially because it goes in line with our vision and mission at SDSB. I think that we have a very interesting course that we've had that was offered at Gurmani was a civic engagement course. That is the kind of course that we need to have. And I think that it should be mandatory for all SDSB students, right? Because unless we engage as citizens and unless we are involved in actual experiential learning, we are not going to be able to make a change in theory alone. Yeah, so for instance, in the Women and Policy course that I teach, which is an elective, there is 20% of the grade is based on primary research, and the primary research usually focuses on women and in the informal economy in Pakistan. So our students have done research in the Kachi Abadis on the outskirts of Lahore, and women involved in very low-paid home-based work. Students have been involved in interviewing domestic workers. And that particular project in which our students interviewed domestic workers and then came up with a fantastic presentation on the policy implications of not recognizing domestic workers as workers in their own rights, not allowing them the same opportunities in terms of wages, in terms of Social Security, maternity leave, and EOBI. That presentation was presented at the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan's annual convention, and it was taken up really well at the HRCP. So that kind of research and activism is something that should be a necessary part of the business school's pedagogical practice. Growing up in Pakistan, everywhere you go, right? The minute you step out of your home, it is so stark that it's hard to ignore. So I remember as a child in the morning going to school, whenever we would stop at the traffic light next to my apartment building, which was the first stop, I would see this young girl who had acid thrown on her face so that she was blind and her face was completely defaced. So to me to look at poverty. What is it that would bring someone like that to my car window, my privileged car window, right? So I remember that was my earliest experience of feeling that something, and what is my responsibility? So poverty was always, and class divisions, because inequality, right? Class divisions are really about inequality. So that was something very central to my interest in public policy, and gender was not. Gender was something that I thought was very superfluous because I did not, and again. It was something that I could not ignore. I remember coming back from my research back to Boston, talking to my supervisors, and I said I had a very clear idea that I would focus on poverty and class, but I never thought that I would look at gender. But what do? All my research shows up these very stark gender inequalities. And so they suggested, my professor suggested that I start studying gender. And really that was the beginning. So my PhD research work is where my interest in gender began, and it was not something I did willingly. It was an additional variable that I would have to collect data on, so it was not something I did willingly. But once I started looking at gender, it was hard to look at look at even poverty and class divisions without looking at gender, right? Because these are intersectional inequalities. Microfinance, again, was a topic that my supervisor suggested I choose to look at for my thesis, because my background, I have an MBA in finance, and then I have a master's in development finance. So it just made sense to look at microfinance because it shows you both sides, right? Microfinance is very much an investment vehicle in the global north and more and more in the global south. So investors are putting in huge amounts of money in microfinance vehicles. And at the same time, microfinance is a development tool. So having those two sides of finance, it just made sense that I look at a phenomena like microfinance to see how well it was doing as a sustainable development intervention, which is how it was portrayed. My own research in Pakistan showed that that sustainability came at the expense of the clients of microfinance. It was being claimed that microfinance was empowering women and that it was reducing poverty. But my research showed that it was actually quite the opposite, that in trying to make microfinance a profitable industry, the industry lost its focus on empowering women and its poverty alleviation claim. I think any intervention before it becomes a tool of corporate finance can be effective in meeting the goals that it sets out to meet, right? So in Pakistan, microfinance actually began in the 70s and the 80s with the Al Khan Rural Support Program, the Orangi Pilot Project, and it was not meant to be this insanely profitable program, right? It was only, it emerged organically as these development professionals saw that these poor communities had entrepreneurial ideas, but they didn't have capital. So they started micro-lending and they started to see good results. They saw that when you give micro capital to poor entrepreneurs, the returns are pretty high. And that was where things were, I would say, at their optimum. But once this idea reached global development experts and global development institutions such as the World Bank, they decided that, well, why not make this a sustainable intervention? And they began to propose higher rates of interest. They began to propose that the cost of monitoring, evaluation, and risk assessment should be passed on to the client themselves, right? And when they started to focus on their own bottom lines, that's when the focus was lost, okay? And in Pakistan, we see the same thing, that when the NGOs running microfinance were turned into microfinance banks that were being regulated by the state bank, then they lost that focus. So for instance, if you look at Kash Foundation, and the National Rural Support Program, they were lending nearly 100% of their funds to women. But after they became microfinance banks, so Kash Bank, the National Rural Support Bank, Tamir Microfinance Bank, their lending was between 90 to 95% being targeted at men. Right? So you see a very sudden and sharp shift from lending to poor women to lending to middle and lower middle income men, right? So that has nothing to do with empowering women. It's all about the bottom line of the bank. Yeah, I would say that we have made a lot of progress since the year 2010. If you just look at the public policies that are focused at reducing gender inequalities, there has been a spate of policy policies that have come out and been passed and implemented that are aimed at, for instance, reducing violence against women, reducing reducing inequalities in asset and income. For instance, the Anti-Women Act, the Anti-Women Crimes Act of 2014 stipulates that preventing women from owning property is a crime, right? So if you look at our data, only 4% of women in Pakistan own rural property, own land. And that is a huge gap, considering that our constitution gives women the right to own property, right? But cultural practices and traditions have prevented women from doing so. So such regulations have been one of the biggest achievements. Also the domestic violence bills, the electoral policies that have been passed, that no district will be, their voting will be accepted unless they have a certain percentage of women voters. So all of these have been, I think, great achievements. Women on board. So we now have to have 33% representation of women on boards, at least in public sector organizations, but also in private sector organizations. So these are huge achievements for women. The women's movement has also taken, thanks to social media, it has become much more accessible. It used to be a very elite women's movement, but now, because of social media, women of various demographics have been able to recognize the facts that these inequalities should not be taken as a given, and that we should ask for our rights, even when it comes to our right to public space, right? So those are things that now are coming into question. And young and older women, rich and poor, are beginning to question these, these socializations, which we've taken for granted. So I think that is a big achievement.